Militant secularization is taking hold of our society. Faith is sidelined, marginalized and downgraded. The words there of Baroness Warsi, the Conservative Party chairwoman. Good evening and welcome to the Politics and Media Show. I'm Phil Rees. Well, in a speech at the Vatican in Rome, the Baroness went on to say that Christians in Europe needed to become more confident and more comfortable in their faith. She blamed faith deniers for attacking all religion with, quote, a vocabulary of secularist intolerance. Well, we'll be discussing Baroness Warsi's speech with those of different faiths and indeed of no faith. Later in the show, Britain's universities do not play a significant role in radicalising young Muslims, according to a parliamentary committee. The internet is a more important factor. So, is all we've heard in the past about universities just a load of old untruths? Well, that's in 25 minutes. But first, in a speech that attracted much debate, Baroness Warsi, who is Britain's first female Muslim cabinet minister, told her mainly Catholic audience in Rome, you should not extract Christian foundations from the evolution of our European nations any more than you can or should erase the spires from our landscapes. Well, here's more on Baroness Warsi's speech from Nina Arif.
Britain's Baroness Warsi has been leading a delegation to meet with Pope Benedict to discuss issues regarding interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance. On a historic visit to the Vatican, the Cabinet Office Minister said that the so-called liberal elite were wrong to claim that faith and reason were incompatible and that religious groups should play a role in public life. The visit was organised in the wake of the Pope's successful state visit to Britain in September 2010, during which he is said to have been impressed by David Cameron's strong defence of the importance of faith in public life. He also criticised, however, what he called aggressive secularism in the UK, a message which Warsi reiterated in her Vatican speech, in which she spoke of the growing danger of militant secularists to British life.
People need to feel stronger in their religious identities and more confident in their beliefs. In practice, this means individuals not diluting their faith and nations not denying their religious heritage. If you take this thought to its conclusion, then the idea that you're left with can simply be put like this: Europe needs to be more confident in its Christianity.
While some point out the irony of a Muslim minister highlighting the importance of Europe being confident in its Christianity, others have welcomed her comments, which come in the wake of several court rulings that have caused Christians to feel their religion is under attack. Recently, a British court ruled that prayers before council meetings should be banned, and prior to that, a Christian couple were fined for refusing to allow a gay couple to stay at their private hotel. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, last year spoke of the pettiness of bureaucrats who stopped employees from wearing religious symbols. But Williams was also aggressively attacked by the media and secularists for once suggesting that Sharia law was a good thing for Britain. And then there was the atheist bus campaign backed by the prominent and relentless atheist Richard Dawkins. It urged you to stop worrying about God and enjoy your life. But while there is evidence of an anti-religion campaign in Britain, critics of Warsi argue that Britain still remains one of the freest countries where people can practice their faith. They say in comparison to countries where people of religion face persecution and can't openly practice, Britain, if anything, is more of a haven. Although on the other hand, it's argued that countries like Saudi Arabia should hardly set the benchmark for what constitutes a free society.
Nina Arif there. Well, the Baroness's main attack was on the people who dine out on free-flowing media and attempt to remove all trace of religion from culture, history and public discourse, as she said. Well, we have in the studio someone she might call a militant secularist, Terry Sanderson, president of the National Secular Society. We also have Rabbi Herschal Gluck from the Muslim Jewish Forum. And on the phone, Fiyaz Mughal from Faith Matters, and from York University, Professor David Jesson, the author of a report on faith schools. Thank you all so much for joining us today in the studio. Well, would you accept that? Militant secularist?
Well, it depends what you mean by militant, doesn't it? I mean, secularism, a term that Baroness Warsi doesn't seem to understand in the slightest. She uses it as some kind of threat, when in fact secularism is the best protection religion can have. As we see from what's happening in the Middle East, where when one religion takes power and it's very powerful and very big, minor religions start to feel the heat. If these places were secular, you would still get persecution, but it wouldn't be state persecution. It would be religions fighting amongst themselves. It wouldn't be done by the state.
So you're not trying to sort of convert people to secularism in any way, are you? That's
yes,
not
I would like people to feel that secularism is a worthwhile and positive thing. I'm not trying to turn them into atheists. I respect their faith. If they want to have faith, that is their business, and I encourage it. I would. You know, it's protected by human rights legislation in this country, something that I'm very keen on. So, no, we're not anti-faith. We're actually about protecting everybody's rights and making sure that nobody can be persecuted because one religion has taken power.
Rabbi Gluck, I mean, fair enough, isn't it? I mean, that sounds all very reasonable there. I mean, what is Baroness Warsi on about?
Whilst I respect what Terry just said, Terry is seeing secularism according to the American model. That in America is a separation of church and state. But that means that people have the right to lead a religious life. If we look historically, people left the UK because of religious persecution, and they set up a new state in North America where they felt they would be able to practice their religion freely. In other words, secularism in that sense means the right to practice religion freely.
So what is Baroness Warsi meaning by that then?
I think what she means that there are certain secularists who are very militant and attack religious people, as Professor Dawkins does, in a very militant way, which without respect and without paying due attention to facts. And I think that type of secularism is something which is very disturbing and which needs to be curtailed.
Fiyaz, Mughal, let me bring you in there. I mean, you wrote recently that about militant secularists who think that people of faith are somehow irrational or maladjusted. I mean, do you think Baroness Warsi had a point then?
She clearly had a point because, you know, we work with faith communities consistently, and I know that Rabbi Herschal Gluck is very involved in this area. What we're seeing clearly is a group of very militant, and I use this term very strongly, militant secularists who believe clearly that people who have faith are not just irrational, but in a way kind of stupid in their belief. Just because they believe in something that is unseen, it's as if they're certainly irrational, and you know, we're seeing this more and more, and we're seeing attacks on belief more and more aggressively through different media sources. Let me come back to the issue that your previous speaker had suggested about secularism giving protection, and he chose the Middle East. Well, I'll give you one example of a secularist leader. Saddam Hussein was a secularist leader who used religion to keep people down in his population. That secularist leader was one of the worst autocrats we had in the Middle East. So giving an example that secularism actually can provide some kind of liberation to the Middle East is not only ignorant, it's actually quite a simplistic view of how people rule their populations.
Terry Sanderson, I mean...
Yeah, secular democracy is the answer. Secularism on its own won't work. As you see, dictators can choose to call themselves secular. They can actually oppress religion. That's not real secularism. We're talking about secular democracy. And in the Middle East, when these revolutions occurred and these dictators were thrown out, there was a lot of hope that secular parliamentary procedures would result. Islam has been brought in on a democratic basis, so we have to see how that will pan out, whether the Islamists will respect that secular idea within the parliaments. I mean, for instance, last week it's very interesting that in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood has a majority in parliament, last week somebody tried to start praying in Parliament, one of the MPs, and the Speaker threw him out and said, this is not the place for that. The mosque is the place for that. Whereas in the British Parliament, prayers are being protected and encouraged. So, you know...
Well, of course, that is a matter of the whole issue of sort of church or mosque and state that we're talking about there. But what about the point, you know, without going down that road yet, that Fiyaz Mughal makes, that somehow in the perhaps elitist media culture, etc., that people of faith are somehow not mocked in some way? That...
Well, I think if there are some people who do think that faith is irrational and foolish, then they are entitled to voice their opinions. I don't see in the media that there is some kind of imbalance on that. I see, you know, the BBC gives special treatment to media, to religion. It has a daily thought for the day, which is restricted to religious people on its prime news programme. It has a religious affairs department that costs £20 million a year. It's got 3 programmes on, 3 hours worth of programmes about Catholicism starting this week. There is no sort of media antagonism towards religion.
Fiyaz Mughal, quick response to that.
Well, it's not I mean, everyone has the right to disagree, and we will all take that position, and it's the right position to take. The fact of the matter here is what we're getting is a parody of religion, and a parody by individuals who have no sense of sensitivity to other people's feelings. You can have a discussion and debate. You can disagree. But in today's society, there is an issue that you have to be at least sensitive. You might not agree with people, but you have to be sensitive. What we're having are secularists parodying religion and actually being abusive in the public space, and then falling back on the position that actually it's my right to be free and say something. There is a social responsibility on us to ensure that in the debate we at least provide a basic sense of respect. If secularists are saying that our role, or their role rather, is to respect communities, then at least live what you are saying, and right now that's not happening.
Can I bring in Professor Jesson there? You did a report, of course, about faith schools. Do you believe that they're treated with enough respect, and generally whether indeed people of faith are treated with enough seriousness when it comes to important matters like education?
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the whole context of Baroness Warsi's speech was about the chipping away of respect for the foundations. And when we think specifically about Europe and in particular about Britain, all of the major elements of our society, the monarchy, the law, education, are all founded on Christian values. So it ill becomes organizations which actually have no respect for those foundations actually to assume that those who belong to them either, as has been said already, are irrational or alternatively need to be marginalized. I think it is very important that any group in fact, that exists in the faith area is given the opportunity not only to maintain the support of its own members, but to convince others of the rightness of its foundations and to engage them in promoting its interests, and in the case of those who respect the faith dimension, of the interests of their understanding of God and his desire to work and to be with his people. But do you find that it's difficult for them to do that, though? That the media, that it's somehow, it's almost an area where people are not allowed to go because it smells of proselytizing, it smells of something that conflicts with freedom? Well, it may conflict with freedom, but I have to say that it may conflict with the concept of freedom that some people have. But actually, when you think back to the foundations, as I say, of the very society in which we live, the Christian values are there at its very heart. So chipping away at this obviously suggests that there is something unreal or inappropriate about the presentation of those foundations in today's values and today's terms. And I think that is where the real danger that Baroness Warsi is talking about actually exists. It's not in a major overthrow of the role of faith in public life. It is actually chipping away and marginalizing, as she said, of the respect and the understanding and perhaps even the possibility of promoting those interests in the society in which we are today. If I may just say one thing about faith schools, they were the very people who developed the education service that we have in our country today. And to suggest that somehow they don't have a right actually to express their religious faith freely within those contexts, I think is just ludicrous. Rabbi Gluck, do you feel that there is this chipping away going on? I mean, do you feel that's happening in terms of Judaism, or do you feel that's going on in Britain?
Sadly, yes. Sadly, there's a minority of people who feel it is their religious duty, even though they don't believe in God, to attack and to undermine the right of religious people to be themselves, to think and to speak and to act according to one's conscience.
It's irrational, you mean? It's made out that those religious arguments do not have a place in public discourse?
I would say that the arguments of the militant secularists are irrational and are not based on facts. They're based on exaggeration. They're based on emotional irrationality. And that I find deeply disturbing.
Terry Sanderson, emotional irrationality.
I find all this conversation rather sinister, with this idea that religion should be protected from criticism, that we can't have a debate about religion. We're not allowed because religion should be protected from this kind of, satire or whatever. If religion is as strong in people's minds as they claim, why can't they just defend it with words? Should
it not respected, as Fiyaz Mughal said?
Why should it be respected? No other idea is given automatic respect. It has to defend itself and make its case, which is what religion is going to have to do. You can't sort of give it... We're going down the road of blasphemy laws here, which are deeply, deeply unjust. We've got to have free speech for everybody, and religion has got to take its part in that debate and defend itself, make its case.
Well, I 100% agree with you, Terry. The fact is that historically, in this debate, the militant secularists have denied facts, have misrepresented reality, and have shown a scant respect for reality. I had a discussion with Professor Dawkins a number of years ago, and what amazed me was his total disregard for facts or for reality. I'm very happy to speak with anyone and give everyone the right to discuss and to express themselves freely. But of course, one has to respect reality and facts. And I saw...
Well, is that what a blasphemy law would do then, in your view?
I'm not speaking about blasphemy law. I am a liberal. I believe that people should be able to express themselves freely and be able to be themselves freely.
Even if it's disrespectful to faith?
I mean, I think in the UK we have a liberal society, but sadly what I find disturbing is certain secularists are not liberal, that they are not respectful of individuals and of facts.
I mean, Fiyaz Mughal, I mean, do you understand, I mean, Terry Sanderson's point here in a way that faith is part of our society, shouldn't have a kind of privilege protection?
Absolutely. I mean, listen, I'm not going to disagree with that. Anything is up for discussion in our society because that is what our society is. And as Rabbi Gluck has said, we believe that this liberal space of discussion should be protected. But as Rabbi Gluck has also mentioned, when there is this aggressive stance, which really is in itself authoritarian, about how people should be thinking or what they should be doing, i.e. by rejecting religion, and then throwing into the mire the fact that, some of the comments are not factual, they're just offensive. That is what we are saying in this debate, that actually people are becoming authoritarian towards those who believe, and that's not right. That's simply what we're saying.
I mean, I think what Fiyaz Mughal is probably talking about is, like in the words of the Archbishop of Canterbury, that faith is looked down as a hobby of oddities, foreigners and minorities, sort of eccentric, pastime, Terry Sanderson. I mean, that's not right, is it?
Well, look at the constitution of this country. The head of state is a very prominent Christian, the Queen. Prime Minister claims to be a Christian. Half of his cabinet claim to be Christians. We have 26 bishops of the Church of England sitting in the House of Lords. A third of the education system is under the control of the Church. What do they want? How much more privilege can they possibly want?
So you don't see that anything is being chipped away at? I mean, you actually would like more chipping away.
Absolutely. It cannot possibly be a fair country when one small denomination of one religion has all this privilege.
Professor Jesson, I mean, do you accept that, in a way, that the faith does play a large role, as you found out in the very schools that you examined that did rather well? So, you know, the chipping away, I mean, perhaps it is hard to define.
Well, I think that the issue here is one about the authoritarianism of those who take that aggressive stance. I think the words are very reflective of what exactly Baroness Warsi was complaining about. The Church, of course, has a very important role. It had, and it continues to have. It doesn't actually use that to proselytize. It's not allowed to do that by law. But I think the fact is that the Christian principles which undergird that education system are important in people's lives, and I think that they're important enough for those who feel under attack by this chipping away that I spoke about actually to speak out. And I welcome the fact that all of us seem to be agreed that standing up for what we believe and being able to discuss it freely and fairly is very, very important indeed. As I sometimes, what we might hear of in terms of what we call the liberal society, and what I mean by that is the media liberal society, actually taking on board to join with the aggressive secularist attacks on not only the idea of the church, but on the idea of faith as a whole. And the research which we did a couple of years ago certainly showed that in terms of the kind of cohesive society that develops, the church schools and the voluntary area are very, very effective in doing that. And to chip away at that, it seems to me, is to chip away at one of the foundations of the society in which we live. And I think that that would be a very, very dangerous step indeed to take much further.
I mean, Terry Sanderson, I mean, the point that obviously Professor Jesson found is that actually church schools are quite cohesive. In fact, that almost your stance is provocative. You're encouraging people of faith to kind of react in certain ways by not being tolerant enough yourself of them.
Well, these words like intolerant and authoritarian and militant are just sort of ways of saying, you shouldn't be criticising us. You should not have an opinion that is not our opinion. And I don't like that, because it tries to take the wind out of the sails of anybody who disagrees with people of faith. And I think that there is another argument about faith schools. Obviously, somebody who's arguing here has got a vested interest. But
he did a report on them, yeah.
Yeah. And he's a very enthusiastic supporter of faith schools. I actually think that they are divisive. How could they not be when they... We're
coming to the end. I'm sorry, we can't go down that road.
Yeah, okay.
Just very final word, though. Do you feel that your stance is provocative? Quickly, yes or no?
No.
No. Do you feel that people like him, his stance can be provocative in what he's saying?
I can't speak about Terry, naturally, but I would say, sadly, there are many people who fly the secularist flag who are extremely provocative.
Well, okay, thank you very much.
Very much agree.
For everyone on this discussion. I'm afraid we could go on, but we're coming to a break now. In part two, a report today says British universities do not radicalise young Muslims. That's not what we heard before, is it? But we'll be discussing that. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. I'm Phil Rees. Well, a Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee report on the roots of violent radicalisation says that universities are not hotbeds of extremism. It found that, quote, a number of convicted terrorists have attended prisons and universities, but there is seldom concrete evidence to confirm that this is where they were radicalised. It concludes that the emphasis on the role of universities by government departments is, quote, disproportionate. A much more significant cause, says the committee, is the internet, which is involved in almost all cases of extremism. Well, the committee's findings seem to conflict with earlier reports from a number of think tanks, which have seemingly provided the basis for the government's Prevent Violent Extremism policy. And just a year ago, a report by a parliamentary Homeland Security group said the evidence that universities were places where young Muslims were radicalised was, quote, damning, and that there was no sign of the risk of extremism diminishing. Well, today's parliamentary report said violent radicalisation was declining within the Muslim community and urged more focus on the far right in the wake of course, the attacks in Norway by white supremacist Anders Breivik, which we all remember killed 77 people. So what's up? What's true? Before our discussion, here's Darren Sharif.
a group of British MPs have concluded that links between radicalisation and universities have been overstated. A report published early this month by the Home Affairs Select Committee, Roots of Violent Radicalisation, says the internet plays a far greater role than universities. It also states that the government's focus on university campuses in the Prevent strategy has been disproportionate. Nearly 1 out of every 3 people convicted of Al-Qaeda-related terrorist offences in the UK between 1999 and 2009 have attended a university or college. However, the committee says that there is seldom concrete evidence to confirm that this is where they were radicalised. The national Muslim student body, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, has welcomed the findings, saying the report represented some desperately needed honesty on the subject. FOSIS had submitted both written evidence to the committee and then oral evidence to share the experience and perspective of Muslim students. And in response to the report, its president Nabil Ahmed said, "The Home Affairs Committee has been useful in confirming what Muslim students and the higher education sector have been saying for some time. Universities are not complacent to the risks of radicalisation, despite ministers' repeated baseless attempts to discredit them." The report should have gone further. Whilst rightly addressing the unnoticed far-right threat, we must not ignore how Muslim students have experienced suspicion and discrimination as a result of government policy. The government needs to be mature here and act accordingly.
Well, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Amandla Johnson from the National Student Muslim Body, FOSIS. And on the phone we have Professor Anthony Glees from Buckingham University. Thank you both for joining us. Professor Glees, you've regularly argued that the universities, as it were, are hotbeds of student radicalism. I mean, after this report, have you changed your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that hotbed is a word I'd use, but actually you need to read what the report says rather than the headline. And let me just quote to you. The report says, quote, "Our evidence suggests that there may be a much less direct link than was thought in the past between universities and extremism, but we believe there is unambiguous evidence to indicate that some extremist organizations target specific universities and colleges with large numbers of Muslim students." And let me just say one other thing too. 55% of people convicted of Islamist terrorist offences either were students at the time they committed those offences or previously. That's a vast amount.
Doesn't that just mean that those who resort to political violence are often well educated?
Well, it may mean that, but why dismiss that evidence? Why say there is no link between higher education? If you want to tell me that a large number of people who go to universities, in proportionate terms, a large number, go on to become extremists and violent extremists, that's fine. That's my argument. We agree with each other.
Amandla Johnson.
I think really the government and any organisation trying to find out the roots of radicalisation must take an evidence-based approach. Now, Anthony, you mentioned that many extremist groups target universities. That's very different from saying that universities themselves are radicalising students. Evidence is absolutely needed on this.
Radicalised students. I've never said that.
Sorry, we missed that comment, Professor. Come back with that again. I'm sorry.
Well, I've never said that universities radicalise students. That's complete nonsense. I've said universities are one place where radicalisation takes place. And the fact that 55% of people in Keith Vaz's own report, that's where these figures come from, 55% of people convicted of terrorist offences either were students or had previously been students, speaks for itself.
So, I mean, Amandla, I suppose the point that Professor's making is that, yeah, it's still true that the university is there. Even this report says that. I mean, what's different in this report?
I think what's different in this report is that the reporters mentioned that there's been overemphasis on universities, overemphasis by the government, by think tanks, as you mentioned as well, for universities to be hotbeds of radicalisation. And I still think that to conclude that because some convicted terrorists have been at universities while convicted, that is simply not enough to say that there's a problem at universities. Convicted terrorists, go through a number of institutions, throughout their lives. But to pinpoint universities as being the sort of locus of their sort of radicalization, I think is quite absurd without any sort of credible evidence.
Now, I mean, there have been quite a lot of course, students, as it were, some of whom have been a famous case at Nottingham, where viewers may or may not be acquainted for, where 2 students were arrested largely for downloading information which Al-Qaeda related documents, which was easily available even in the university library. I mean, do you feel that the reports in the past had created as it were, an environment of a sort of witch hunt at universities?
Sure. I mean, as the report now mentions, there has been, sort of a lack of emphasis on sort of right-wing groups, which really shows that, institutions, the government, have been focusing too much on Muslim students in a sort of witch hunt, as you mentioned. The other groups who may potentially pose a threat, but by focusing on one group in particular, you allow these other groups to proliferate, to grow in strength and numbers, and they become a threatening of themselves.
But are there groups that, as Professor Glees is suggesting, where, that exist in universities that are trying to radicalise students?
As far as I'm aware, I have not come across such groups. Being someone who's been president of 2 Islamic societies, have been involved in FOSIS for a number of years, I'm not aware of such groups.
Professor Glees, I mean, Amandla Johnson should know, shouldn't he? And these groups he's not aware of.
Well, FOSIS have continually tried to suggest that I'm a nitwit and a fantasist. On their website, you'll find the accusation that I'm widely discredited as an academic. I come back to the hard facts here. 55% of people convicted of Islamist extremist attacks have been to university. That's a hard fact, and it's a fact that's recognised even by Keith Vaz's report. And if I may say one other thing, it's entirely up to Keith Vaz whom he wishes to invite to give evidence to him and whom he doesn't. But it is not without significance that he didn't invite me to give evidence, although the all-party Parliamentary Committee on Homeland Security did ask me to give evidence. Keith Vaz didn't. Who did he take evidence from? FOSIS, Nabil Ahmed, and a group of SOAS students. Well, of course, it's blindingly obvious that people on the front line who have a vested interest in denying the existence of this problem will deny the existence of that problem.
Are you saying that these parliamentary committee reports then are all rather political? One says one thing, one says the other, depending on who they invite?
Absolutely, absolutely. What's particularly the case with Keith Vaz, he goes out of his way to thank De Montfort University in Leicester. He's taken evidence from Universities UK. The evidence came not from a political scientist or an analyst of extremism, but somebody who'd been a professor of geography. And these are the people. Universities UK want as many people from all over the world to go to university, and they care very little for the sorts of things that we're debating here this afternoon.
Okay, but let me ask you, I mean, do you feel it's right that university professors should be, as it were, monitoring their students for their political views? I mean, doesn't that smack of McCarthyism?
That is absolute nonsense. And you should not forget the reason why higher education is important is not only because 55% of the people convicted went to university, but because if universities do their job properly, this is a problem that could be easily solved. I accept what...
Well, so you want them to spy on their students?
Well, you say spy on their students. That's not the way I would refer to it. Should a professor know if a student of his or hers is becoming a violent extremist? Of course they should. That is what higher education is about.
Amandla Johnson,
to know who your students are.
Professor, thank you. Amandla Johnson, you've heard Professor Glees there. I mean, obviously feeling that, A, the problem is still there, but secondly, that professors should be, perhaps he doesn't like my term spying, I don't know how you'd call it, but a kind of monitoring takes place of the political views of students.
Well, I think really we have, we have organisations such as the police, such as other, defence organisations, which are trained, in order to actually detect any problems, with people in the community who may be on the route to violent extremism. To assume that we could have teachers, professors, people who have an academic background to be able to monitor students, I think is absolutely crazy. I mean, what exactly are they looking for? Is it going to be a case of a woman deciding to wear a headscarf? Is it going to be the case of a man trying to grow a beard? And what exactly...
what is extremism in your view then? I mean, what is this term is used a lot? Is it well defined?
I don't think it is well defined. I mean, we hear a sort of plethora of different terms. We hear radicals, we hear violent extremists, we hear extremists. And it seems as though when a Muslim student decides to do something radical, a lot of emphasis and a lot of sort of attention is paid to it. But when other students, who may be animal rights campaigners, human rights campaigners, decide to stage protests, decide to have occupations at university, which are equally as radical in many cases, these are sort of not looked at in such detail. So I think the terms we use and the definitions we use, have a lot to play in this. As far as I'm concerned, the word radical, which goes back towards, some sort of going back to the roots of something. If you look at it sort of etymology, it's something which is not bad. It's something which universities have long, been, sort of place for. And I think that we really need to sort of have a wider sort of appreciation, of what Muslim students are doing in comparison to other students as well.
I mean, Professor Glees, I mean, isn't this a point that people should have radical ideas at university? That's part of what university life's about, intellectual freedom. You're suggesting that somehow nobody who's, of course, we're not talking about people who are plotting things now or have, explosives on their hands, of course not. But you're talking about people whose ideas are somehow dangerous and that somehow should be reported somewhere else. Doesn't that smack of kind of totalitarianism?
Well, I don't think so at all. And of course it is true that not every radical is an extremist and that not every extremist is a violent extremist. Of course that's true. On the other hand, every violent extremist started off as a radical. And that's why this is something that needs to be looked at.
So how would you define... Sorry, Professor, sorry to interrupt there, but it's quite important. How would you define a radical? I mean, if a Muslim believes and is quite active in, for example, criticising British involvement in Afghanistan and, perhaps understanding the rights of people to defend their own country against occupation, is that a radical idea?
Well, the two ideas aren't the same. I mean, terrorism, which is what is implied by the second issue that you raised, is not the same as disagreeing with government policy, which may be radical, as I say. Not every radical is an extremist, let alone a violent extremist. But, the really important thing to bear in mind is we're talking about higher education here. We're talking about what professors and lecturers should do when it comes to teaching their students. And Mr. Johnson says, they shouldn't, they shouldn't monitor students. But, of course, that is exactly what students go to university for, to be monitored. And their political education is very much part of it. No, of course, students, like anybody else, should have radical views if they want to.
So which ideas should be banned? I mean, what ideas can a Muslim not have? Or, I mean, and again, if you say that every so-called terrorist started off as a radical, well, at what stage? I mean, we're talking now about thought crimes, are we? We're talking about hypothetical future actions. I mean, at what time is this person, as it were, intercepted by his professor?
Well, you intercept people, whether they're students or anybody else, when they are intent on breaking the law. So the point at entry is actually quite high up. Now, I have to tell you that FOSIS have frequently invited me to speak at meetings they've organised and so on. Wherever I've been able, I've tried to accept those invitations. And every time I've accepted an invitation and spoken to a segregated audience, that is to say, an audience with men on one side and separated from them on the other side, women students, I've said that is, for me, unacceptable. It's not a crime, as far as I understand, but it's certainly radical.
It's a radical idea.
For me, it is unacceptable. All students are the same, whatever their gender. And then there is a sliding scale that takes you towards a wish to violently overthrow or change the policies of this country.
But I think there really is, a gulf of difference between, two sides of the, of our genders actually choosing, having the autonomy to choose where they sit,
and
actually deciding to go and sort of, you know, bomb airplanes or trains or cars.
Women who go to a meeting and sit on one side, I mean, they don't. I assume they're not forced there, Professor?
Well, the women that wanted to come and listen to me had no choice. They had to sit in a segregated hall.
I mean, but doesn't this point to the fact that, you know, as you say, you consider that a radical idea, that Amandla Johnson, that it's in fact, it's very hard to define the whole sense of the kind of mind, you know, thought crimes that are implied in the prevent strategy when non-violent extremism is thrown in with what one would assume extremism that involves direct action.
Yeah, and I think the problem we have here is that, you know, there are many sort of conservative Muslim values which many Muslims at universities follow, such as choosing to maybe separate the two genders, you know, at events, as Anthony Glees has mentioned. Now, if these are now being defined as being radical and as being on the conveyor belt to extremism, as it were, then this is actually very worrying, that Muslims feel they can't actually practice their faith fully and to the fullest extent.
Well, I mean, that is a fair point, isn't it, Professor? That if you are going to say something that is very much part of Muslim tradition, which is segregation, I mean, you know, it almost makes any Muslim who wants to display his faith feel that next step he's going to be considered a terrorist.
No, again, you see how FOSIS operates here. The claim was made that people who believe in forceful segregation of the genders are a step nearer violent extremism. I didn't say that, and your listeners and viewers will know that I didn't say that. You asked me, what did I understand by radical, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable. I'm saying to you that segregation on the basis of gender here in the United Kingdom is not acceptable to me. That's what I'm saying, and I'm saying university professors have the duty to spell this out, as I've done.
So you're
myself.
saying that university professors should, I know we're veering away from the subject here, but you're saying that university professors should actually prevent meetings at universities being segregated?
I didn't say prevent. I said if it isn't against the law, I think the law needs to be tested here. It may well be against the gender discrimination laws in this country, I don't know. But I'm saying that professors like me who accept invitations from FOSIS should speak out about discrimination. That's what I do, and to give them their due, FOSIS let me say it. But don't let's pretend this isn't a radical idea in the context of British society where we have gender equality.
But are you saying that a lot of the essential principles of the faith are effectively radical?
I'm saying that radicalism is something we should always keep our eye on. And just to make this entirely clear, I am told that in some Jewish synagogues, men and women have to sit in a segregated way. And in my own view, that is a radical idea, and it's not acceptable.
Okay.
The bottom line is violent extremism is against the law of this land, and it is something certainly which professors, doctors, lawyers should monitor.
Professor, thank you very much. Amandla Johnson, I mean, what do you think here? There should be monitoring of behaviour, including those who prefer to segregate. I don't know, general involvement of this. What do you say? We're coming to an end, so please sum up.
Yeah. I mean, well, I'm actually very, very confused about what Anthony Glees is saying. On one side, he's saying that segregation between the sexes is radical, but then he's saying that that's not actually part of the conveyor belt towards violent extremism. Then on the other hand, he's saying that nevertheless, university professors and academics should still spy on those students, even though he says they pose no threat towards violent extremism. So it seems to me as though he's trying to sort of broaden, you know, the sort of scope of surveillance of Muslim students to include things which are very conservative, things which are traditional Islamic, as being part of a whole sort of cauldron of behaviours, of sort of thought patterns, which he considers to be on the pathway to violent extremism. And I think that's extremely worrying.
Look, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're coming to the end. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Professor Glees, thank you for joining us. Amandla Johnson, indeed. Next week, John Rees, by the way, no relation to me, Phil Rees, will be back presenting the show as usual. For now, a big thank you to all our guests and to you at home for joining us. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.